Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning to our audience in Washington in the United States, and good evening to our participants from Japan and across Asia. I'm Mike Green from CSIS and Georgetown University. And on behalf of CSIS and our partners at the Japan Institute for International Affairs, I want to welcome you to this readout and discussion on the 28th annual U.S. Japan Security Seminar. Our discussion today will be conducted in English, but we are providing simultaneous interpreting into Japanese. You can find that by using the icon on the bottom of your screen that says interpretation. This seminar has been held for over a quarter of a century, as I noted, and has been an important opportunity for a 1.5 track discussion for officials from both the US and Japanese governments, former and future officials, scholars, to compare notes, to see where there are areas of divergence, to develop areas of convergence, to test our assumptions and our concepts, and often very, very important health checks on the alliance, but also idea generating, agenda setting opportunities. We met yesterday in an off the record session, and I was at the first of these seminars 28 years ago, and I've been at most since. And I have to say, in this one, the US and Japanese definition of the challenges of our shared interests and values, of the areas where we need to improve our capabilities, do more diplomacy, better deterrence, and so forth. There's never been more alignment between government, non-government experts between the US and Japan. It was quite striking. And at the same time, a recognition that we've rarely faced in the 28 years we've done this seminar, a security environment that was quite so complicated and challenging. We're going to hear from several of the leaders in that dialogue from both sides. But first, we'd like to share with you a greeting from Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi, who presented this at the beginning of our closed session and asked that we share it with you. So please stay tuned. It's delivered in English. This is Foreign Minister Hayashi.
Dear friends and colleagues, I would like to extend my deep appreciation to CSIS and JIIA for co-hosting the 28th Japan-US Security Seminar. As an alumnus speaking at this seminar in 2019, I am very pleased that this seminar continues to be a platform where both Japan and the US bring together their wisdom and learn from each other, sharing the same goal of strengthening the Japan-US alliance for ensuring the security and prosperity of the region. This year's seminar is held at an extremely important moment as the world faces a fundamental change in the strategic environment. What I would like to stress is a qualitative change in the international security. The international community has long been supported by universal values such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. However, the logic of power is becoming increasingly manifest in recent years. The existing international order is now shaken by power. The power I mention here involves not only military muscles, but also economic and technological clout. In the Indo-Pacific region and elsewhere, we are facing, in addition to traditional military expansionism, unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force, and enhanced cyber threats in so-called gray zone situations. There are some countries that take advantage of their economic might to achieve their national interests. They are leveraging trade relations and supply chain vulnerabilities as tools of economic coercion. Advanced technologies such as AI, 5G, and robotics have already had big impacts not only on military power balance, but also socio-economic relations in the world. In the West, intense debates continue on issue of ethics human rights, and privacy concerning the application of these technologies. Elsewhere, these technologies sustain a model of growth with strict social control, which would be attractive for some other countries. Against this backdrop, Japan and the U.S., together with like-minded countries, must look 15 to 20 years ahead and redouble their efforts to restore regional power balance. Such efforts should be a multifaceted undertaking to reinforce our national strengths, including economic growth and advance in technologies, as well as military capabilities. With regard to economic security, we must collaborate with industries to strengthen our strategic indispensability in the global supply chain, especially in the area of emerging technologies. We must also ensure strategic resilience and autonomy of our economy so that we continue to benefit from the open global economy and still be resilient against economic coercion. At the same time, beyond responding to power-based challenges, we must demonstrate the relevance and appeal of the free, open, and rule-based international order. We must prove that under such an order, we can find effective and sustainable prescriptions to the challenges that we are facing. I believe that when the balance of power is restored by these efforts, diplomacy will work even more effectively to reduce tensions and bring about enduring peace and stability in the region. In the face of this fundamental change in the strategic environment, the Japan-US alliance has become more important than ever. At the recent 2+2, I had the opportunity to discuss with Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin, and Minister Kishi how we can evolve the alliance to continue to effectively respond to the challenges of today and of the future. While I will not repeat what we said in the joint statement, as my contribution to this seminar, let me share with you the following 4 takeaways from the meeting. Number 1 is the importance of maintaining a common strategic picture on the security environment of the region, including China and North Korea. The 2+2 showed that the alliance is more aligned than ever and shares the resolve to work together to deter and respond to destabilizing activities in the region. Number 2 is a resolve to fundamentally enhance the deterrence and response capabilities of the alliance in order to effectively deal with existing challenges. The alliance identified asset protection, joint ISR, realistic training, flexible deterrence options, strategic messaging, and joint shared use of some of the focus areas. We will further identify and invest in efforts to enhance cross-domain capability, readiness, resilience, and interoperability. To this end, Japan will work to fundamentally strengthen its defense capabilities with a sense of speed. Needless to say, our efforts on aligning our key strategic documents will underpin our efforts and will be our major task for this year. Number 3 is making investments to maintain the competitive edge of the alliance in the emerging technologies into the future. The alliance must always stay ahead of the curve in the face of accelerating technological trends. Key tenets to this end require us to deepen cooperation in space and cyber, as well as advanced technologies including AI, quantum science, and hypersonic propulsion. Of course, we need to ensure enhanced information security, which is foundational to such cooperation. Lastly, collaboration with like-minded countries and partners to sustain and enhance a free and open Indo-Pacific, which reinforces the efforts to strengthen the alliance. Enhancing cooperation through the Quad, Japan-US-Australia, or Japan-US-ROK, as well as collaboration with ASEAN and European nations are important force multipliers of the alliance. These 4 points are quite fitting to the 2 main agenda items of this seminar, which are strategic trends and defense and deterrence. I hope that vigorous discussions at this seminar, including on these points, will provide further guidance to the alliance. I would like to conclude my message with my best wishes for the success of this seminar. Thank you very much.
We are thankful to Minister Hayashi for joining us yesterday and today by video. And we indeed did have vigorous discussions on the points he raised. And to discuss them now, I'm joined by 3 colleagues who were involved in our discussions. Ambassador Kenichiro Sasae, former ambassador to the United States and president of the Japan Institute for International Affairs, JIIA. Tetsuo Kotani, a senior fellow at JIIA and a professor of global studies at Meikai University. And Dr. Bonny Lin, director of the China Power Project and senior fellow in Asian security at CSIS. So I'll begin with Sasae Taishi. I was quite struck by a number of things Minister Hayashi said. This was more than just good wishes for a conference. It was a very rich strategic presentation. I imagine your former colleagues in MOFA spent a lot of time thinking about the content. I was struck, and others, by his use of the word restore balance of power, not maintain, but restore, which suggests some concern and urgency, the focus on technology and specific technologies, and the commitment to invest in a speedy way in Japan's own defense capabilities, and to align strategic documents within the Japanese government and with the US. So big themes, but let me start with you on the strategic documents, Ken. Japan is now preparing its second national security strategy. The first in 2013 by the Abe government held up very well. But circumstances have changed since then, as Minister Hayashi's speech suggests. Can you give us some idea what the themes will be and the strategic elements of this new national security strategy we can expect later this year?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Mike, for having me and doing this together. About your question, what this Japanese new national, security policy be looking like, as my thinking is that possibly it will be reflecting the 2+2 statement that was well written. So when it comes to the alliance agenda, I think whatever the substance might be, that will be following through all these documents. But having said it, I think there is still debate going on. One is clear, as Minister Hayashi said, the environment in which we operate will be worse than year 2013, when the former guideline, the policy was laid out. So I think that is going around not only North Korea, but also China. So I see China will continue to be the major elements of this security debate, although how it will be phrased could be more benign. And number 2 is that, as also explained by Minister Hayashi, there will be some diplomatic elements to this security policy framework. And that is in line with basically the Indo-Pacific, strategy laid out by the American government recent time, and in conjunction with our own sense of what's happening in Indo-Pacific. And that would include, of course, not only US and Japan, but also, Quads, EU, and also ASEAN. ASEAN continue to be important, and also, Pacific Island nations. And number 3 is that on the defense side, there will be much stress on the, as Minister said, the speedy build up of defense capability. How speedy it will be, that remains to be seen. But I think there is a political will that we have to level up the capacity as quickly as possible. I think the debating point is obviously all this, controversial, I would say, the offensive capability or counter, capability, and that remains to be debated. But my guess is that there has to be some fundamental conclusion to this one. This had been overdue for some time. Then finally, role and mission. I think that was well already said by Minister. But again, there is going to be a very deep, I would say, discussion taking place, and there'll be fundamental, suggestions, hopefully coming out from this national policy.
And Sasae-san, can you tell us about the new U.S. Japan economic 2+2 on our side? Is there a real agenda, or is it just a talk shop? What should we expect?
No. That's the real agenda. I mean, that'll be I guess that this economic part will be a critical part of new national security policy. And as you know, there have been already legislations undertaken to be proposed. And this one is preceding, actually. My guess is this is a part of the overall new national security policy. So this economic security component had been already addressed among the experts. There has been recommendation by the expert. I think the NSS is now working on the specific legislation, and they are ready to go. That includes, of course, all this familiar issue like government to private sector, technological collaboration, the safeguard of critical infrastructure, and confidentiality of patents and so forth.
When Prime Minister Abe established the National Security Council or staff in 2012-13, there was no directorate covering economic and technology and economic security issues, and now there is. And also, the Biden administration has established a major directorate on technology competition. So there's focus in both the White House and the Kante, and it looks like Japan's economic security legislation and also the U.S. legislation. The name keeps changing, but it's also about economic security, semiconductors, investment screening. Looks like they might pass around the same time. So the two governments in this forum, this economic 2+2, will have some tools possibly by the middle of this year to actually, and resources from the Congress and the Diet to really work with. So I'll look forward to doing that.
Yeah, I hope that will be the case. I mean, all this economic 2+2, I think need to focus on the technology part as priority issues. And that's not simply a bilateral, but also go beyond that one to the regional approach. How that will be successful? Regional, technology agreements. We need to explore a bit how we would do it.
So, Kotani-san, in Minister Hayashi's comments, but also in the discussion yesterday, there was a sense of real urgency about strengthening deterrence, integrated deterrence, and among our Japanese participants, increasing the defense budget and moving quickly to fill gaps in capabilities. And that urgency comes after, 12 years, I think, of increasing defense budgets in Japan. And yet, on a per capita basis, Japan still, in defense spending, ranks around Barbados or other peaceful countries in the Caribbean that do not live near North Korea and China and Russia. And it's still only slightly above 1% of GDP, it looks like. What can we anticipate in the coming years in terms of Japan's defense budget and capabilities building, given how urgent and serious the external environment is?
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks for CSIS for collaborating with us. And regarding the defense spending, I think Japan is now very much determined to increase the defense spending over perhaps 10 years. So last year, under Suga government, there was a 2+2 meeting. And in that joint statement, Japan pledged to fundamentally reinforce our own defense capabilities. And last September, there was a lower house election, and the LDP pledged to increase the defense spending up to 2% of GDP. And I think under the Kishida government, there's a consensus that without increasing our defense spending, we cannot meet the objective of building up our own defense capability and to enhance the alliance cooperation. So this fiscal year, the total number of normal defense budget and the supplemental defense budget was about 6 trillion yen. And I think this will be a foundation for the future defense spending. So, of course, there's a fiscal challenge, particularly due to the COVID-19. But at least I think there's a political momentum to increase our defense spending over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I noticed the LDP in its new platform promised 2% of GDP defense spending, which of course was the campaign promise of Takaichi Sanae, who now is in charge of writing the LDP platform. But the LDP platform also says Japan will revise Article 9 of the Constitution, and it has for, longer than I've been on this planet. So is 2% of GDP realistic? What are we going to see continued incremental increases, or is there's serious debate about going up in a much larger way? Maybe not 2%, but 1.5% of GDP or something more significant.
Well, I don't think there's any consensus among the Japanese experts about the final outcome of this debate. But at least I think as I said, there's a consensus that without increasing our defense spending, we cannot defend our country. So it may end up with 1.5%, 1.7%. But I don't think, our defense spending has been virtually flat, the 1% of GDP, but that will not be the case over the upcoming several years.
Yeah, and the ease really with which the U.S. and Japanese governments negotiated the new host nation support agreement for U.S. forces. I mean, that was surprising. It looked on the outside surprisingly easy, and it was a good increase. And that is maybe a foreshadow of the resolve in Japan to do more on defense spending. We talked yesterday a lot about the new Indo-Pacific strategy from the White House, and some of us had the impression that our Japanese colleagues read it much more carefully and with much more insight than the Americans. But give us your take on the White House Indo-Pacific strategy we just saw come out.
Yeah, so compared to the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific framework, I think the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy was more kind of reassuring because the Trump administration's approach was almost kind of undermining the CCP rule in China, or maybe even regime change in Beijing. But the Biden administration, what the Biden administration is looking for is the kind of a coexistence with China. And yes, the recent strategy says it does not seek to change China, but to change the environment surrounding China. But I think it's a right approach, not only for the United States, but also for U.S. allies and friends in this region, because we are not seeking a shaping Chinese behavior by undermining the CCP rule. But what we are trying to preserve is the rules-based order in this region, and also the preservation of our democratic value. So in that sense, I think the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy is very much reassuring. And I think there are lots of rooms for both Japan and the United States can work together. That said, however, of course, there are certain uncertainties remaining. For example, we are not sure what the integrated deterrence really means. Seems like the Pentagon is talking about everything from cross-domain operations, whole of government approach, and alliance cooperation. But we don't see priorities in that explanation. And we are not seeing how the Biden administration can enhance the deterrence capability in this region. So we like to see the definition of integrated deterrence as soon as possible. And plus, the economic aspect is very weak, I think. The strategy is saying that the administration will sooner or later adopt the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but it seems like it will be basically an economic security framework rather than a free trade framework. If so, I think many Asian countries will be disappointed. So I think this free trade issue is the number one challenge in some sense for the Biden administration.
That's a very insightful reading of the strategy, and I think you're right. The message in the Trump version of Free and Open Indo-Pacific was not always explicit, but sounded an awful lot like regime change. This ends when the Chinese Communist Party collapses, and the new Indo-Pacific strategy from the Biden White House doesn't have that. And in a way, when they state that the goal is not to shape China, but to shape the environment around China, what they probably should have said, which is implicit, is by shaping the environment around China and building partnerships and deterrence and investing in Asia in resilience and infrastructure, you may not shape China's politics, but you can shape China's choices. And I think that's implicit, and I assume that's what they had in mind. And you're absolutely right on the economic side. The Indo-Pacific economic framework is still to be built. It's not even a blueprint. It's a kind of a sign saying coming soon. But there's clearly no consensus in the administration about a very fundamental question: is an economic relationship with China beneficial for the U.S.? There's no consensus. Soybean farmers who export, consumers who buy imports would say yes. The Pentagon or those concerned about competition in quantum would say no. And my sense is there's more consensus about this in Japan than there is in the US by far, although Japan has its debates. So I think this economic 2+2 will be an arena where Japan can actually help the US find its way to some kind of consensus on that very, very fundamental question. For the audience, you can ask questions. You'll see on your screen an icon to do that. You can ask questions. You type them, and then I'll see them, and I'll direct them to our panelists as we proceed. But let me first turn to Bonny Lin. Bonny, as we speak, artillery duels and tensions, not just tensions, the fighting is escalating in eastern Ukraine. And there's a lot of debate in Washington and around the world about what this means for security in the Western Pacific, especially for Taiwan. And as you've seen, there's an argument that we need to stand back in Ukraine so that we're ready for Taiwan. The other argument, which I would associate myself with, is no, this is a global problem, this kind of gray zone coercion, and we need to mobilize our allies. But how do you see how will Beijing look at this, and how will Beijing interpret this in terms of its own strategy for Taiwan, and what does that mean for the U.S. and Japan?
Thank you, Mike. I just want to preface my remarks by noting that I very much learned quite a bit from the seminar yesterday, and it was my first one. And I thought it was incredibly rich. We did touch upon Ukraine, and hopefully I'll reflect some of this in my discussion. With respect to your question on how to view dynamics in the Ukraine, whether this is a situation or a conflict that should be viewed as the United States should try to not be bogged down in Ukraine in order to divert or in order to focus more attention on the Indo-Pacific, or whether this is a problem that will have significant ramifications for the Indo-Pacific and East Asia. So the United States should spend as much effort as needed in order to deter Russia from using its military force or escalate the situation. I am definitely with you on the viewing this situation in Ukraine as having much larger implications, not only for Europe, but also for the Indo-Pacific at large. Let me just touch on briefly first on how China views the situation. So from the Chinese perspective, it was very much on the same page as Western analysts in December in assessing that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine. But what was interesting was in January and February, as we've been receiving updated information on Russian moves, including the recent news that Russia will be engaging in a nuclear exercise this weekend, this Saturday, there's been heightened concern on the West that Russia is actually seeking to potentially invade Ukraine or escalate the conflict in ways beyond just using Ukraine as negotiation with the West. But there's been no change on the Chinese perspective. China has maintained a line that Russia will not invade Ukraine. In terms of what that means and how China might respond, after what we saw in the Xi-Putin statement from right before the Olympics, I think there's general consensus, at least from Western observers, that China will support Russia to some extent. But what there's no consensus on is what type of support that will be and to what extent China will support Russia. I think most are assuming at least some form of political support, if not economic support. But even now, we're not sure where China's stance is, mainly because China has been very careful in what it has shown with respect to that. In terms of the larger ramifications of the Ukraine conflict, I would say that this conflict has the potential to reshape the geostrategic landscape at large. So if Russia invades and we see a relatively firm and strong response from the United States, NATO, and other countries denouncing Russian aggression and imposing financial economic sanctions on Russia, and we see China supporting Russia, we would see a strengthening of China's ties with Russia, likely at the cost of EU-China relations and U.S.-China relations. There would also be increasing pressure from countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan and elsewhere, to choose sides between Russia and China on one end and between US and NATO on the other end. As much as China and Russia like to say, are saying that they do not and oppose Cold War mentality and formation of security blocs, if Russia does invade Ukraine, that is what they will be doing. They will be forcing the world to form these Cold War security blocs. I would note that if conflict erupts, there will be very big questions on what that means for the future of the Indo-Pacific, even if the Ukraine crisis, we're able to deal with the Ukraine crisis well on the Europe side. There'll be big questions in terms of what Russia may expect of, what China may expect of Russian support in future tensions and conflicts on its periphery. I think we would have to take into consideration the possibility of coordinated Russian military activity to support China in conflicts in Taiwan, in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and China would probably be expecting Russia to align with it in an event of a China-India conflict. So in short, there's so much that we need to watch in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. We need to look at how China will respond to Russia. We need to look at what will happen, but also lessons learned from all sides. And I don't think we can fully tease out the lessons learned until we have somewhat of a resolution of what's happening in Ukraine.
So, by the way, we already have some good questions coming in, which I'll get to in a moment. And the audience can ask their questions by going to the homepage for this event on the CSIS website and typing in your questions, which I'll see. turning again to Taiwan, Bonnie, it has really been striking the last year how outspoken, of course, the U.S., but also Japan and Australia, senior political figures and government officials, how outspoken they've been about the importance of security for Taiwan through their country's security. And in Nikkei Shimbun polling, 3/4 of the Japanese public agree with that. How do you assess the support for Taiwan among major democracies, particularly in Asia? And you've spent a lot of time thinking about Taiwan contingencies. What do you anticipate the demands would be on Japan, or the diplomatic and other opportunities for Japan if Xi Jinping takes the wrong lesson from Ukraine at some point and tries some form of coercion against Taiwan?
Thank you, Mike. In terms of U.S. Japan cooperation and efforts on Taiwan, I would say it's a lot. We're doing a lot more than just the statements that you mentioned. So a lot of what was discussed earlier in terms of the coordination of our security strategy, the investment in capabilities, the investment in new emerging technologies, all of this, the strengthening of the U.S.-Japan alliance, all of this is absolutely critical when we think about what both sides could do for Taiwan. Other topics that we touched on during the seminar that I think are important to flag because it reflects how China thinks about the situation too, is we talked at the seminar about the strengthening relationship between also Japan and Vietnam, what could happen with the Philippines. China puts all of this together because China doesn't think of Taiwan just in isolation, but also thinks about respect to what's happening in the South China Sea as well as the East China Sea. So in that respect, I think that we're very much on the right track with Japan, and we're doing a lot more than just the statements that seem to attract quite a bit of attention on the Chinese side. In terms of what we could do more, we also covered a bit of that too. And that includes further strengthening of US and also Japanese relations with other countries in the region. So the Japan's reciprocal access agreement with Australia is a very significant move. And if Japan further uses that model for other countries, such as the United Kingdom, I think that would cause China to rethink some of how it views the Taiwan problem set. In terms of what else we're doing with respect to assisting Taiwan, we're doing quite a bit on the economic side. We just talked about the supply chain resilience. And also Japan plays a key role in thinking about incorporating Taiwan potentially in the CPTPP, which will be quite critical to helping Taiwan economically.
I think we need to keep an eye on the epicenter of this whole Taiwan issue, which of course is Taipei. And my sense is one reason that there's been such a growth in public support for the security of Taiwan is because Tsai Ing-wen is being so careful and strategic not to make it difficult for Canberra or Tokyo or European countries to support Taiwan. You know, when I was in the White House 15, 20 years ago, we were not quite as lucky. A lot of countries viewed Taipei as unpredictable and were nervous about extending support publicly. And I think it bears repeating that Tsai Ing-wen's very steady hand on Taiwan's position is making it much easier for other countries to really come forward at a time when Taiwan's under huge stress and duress from Beijing.
If I could add to that, I think that is one area that folks are very much focused on. So what's happening next in Taiwan? And would the next leaders of Taiwan have the very balanced nature that President Tsai has, or will there be some different calculation or motivations? Well, I've had a number of discussions with folks on this, and some, particularly on the Taiwan side, believe that there will be some restraint on Taiwan leaders because Taiwan leaders will, in some respect, have to be practical about their defense choices as well as their strategic choices. So they are recognizing the power imbalance between China and Taiwan. So even if, for example, we do have a next leader of Taiwan that is more pro-independence leaning, there will be some consideration that the military balance of power is not shifting in favor of Taiwan moves towards independence. On the other hand, there has been some concern that experts have voiced that given the historic role that the United States has played in some ways in restraining particular Taiwan leaders in the past, maybe that appetite on the U.S. side won't necessarily be there. So I don't know how to weigh these two factors, because one factor is arguing for restraint from the Chinese due to Chinese military balance, and the other from the U.S. side. So I think there's a lot to watch with respect to Taiwan.
Thank you. Let me turn to the questions. The first question is from Jaedok Sen from Radio Free Asia. And the question is about North Korea. North Korea has tested 7 missiles in this first month and a half of 2022. That's more than all the tests in 2021. There's growing concern that North Korea may resume intercontinental ballistic missile tests, maybe nuclear weapons tests. They're clearly ratcheting up the provocations, maybe exploiting the tensions over Ukraine right now or Taiwan. Let me start with Ken, but the specific question is, how will the U.S. and Japan deal with possible hypersonic and more ballistic missile capabilities from North Korea? And can we expect some strengthening of U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral security cooperation, or even some improvement in Japan-Korea relations, maybe after the Korean election in a few weeks' time? So let me start with Ken and then go to Kotani-san on that one.
Well, thank you very much. On the North Korean issues, when it comes to this specific questions of supersonic missile threat, I think we have to do both for the missile defense. The current one could be updated and improved. And also, I think there should be some introductions of offensive capacity too. Even if we try to negotiate with North Korea on the curbing of their missile development and elimination of nuclear weapons, I'm not quite sure that our negotiation will be successful. I'm not going to say that it will be failing again, because it's a history of failure, I would say, more than 2 decades or even three decades, we could say. So, we have to prepare for the de facto coexistence of North Korean missile and nuclear weapons. So what do? The answer is that we need to update and increase our deterrence capability together with the United States. So I think that's the first, answer to the question you are talking about. Is the current, asset able to prevent this supersonic? I think Kotani-san have something to say. I'm told that we could just do something, but it's difficult. But some people say that it's possible. Perhaps Kotani-san, you would address this question.
Kotani-san, you get the technology question.
Yes. So to respond to the hypersonic missile threats, there are several ways, including the upgrading our own our existing missile defense system. But I think what we have to do is, first of all, to upgrade our sensors to track the incoming missiles. And I think it's important for Japan and the United States to further enhance our space capabilities to track the hypersonic missiles. And that's already in the agenda of the alliance. And also, I think, in the recent 2+2, the two governments agreed to start the joint study of the hypersonic technologies. And I think which includes the joint study or even a joint development of new interceptors. And I understand that the United States is already doing the research on the interceptors to deal with the incoming hypersonic missiles. And I think Japan can join in that development program. And together we can further enhance our interceptor capabilities. And also, as Ambassador Sasae already mentioned, there's a discussion inside Japan about the position of strike capabilities. This is not going to be a first strike or a preemptive strike capabilities. I think this is going to be a counter strike capabilities. We will deal with the first strike by our missile defense system, but we will utilize our counter strike capabilities to disrupt the further missile launches by the adversaries. So here again, I think it's very important for the two allies to define the division of labor for the counter-strike operations. So by doing so, I think we can expect to enhance our deterrence.
That counter-strike capability is not deterrence by punishment, right? It's not holding Chinese assets at risk to deter China. It's rather being able to hit launch sites and specific threats to Japan. Is that what you're saying, Kotani?
Yeah, that's part of our deterrence by denial.
And of course, that's an extremely complicated mission. Yes. In terms of command and control, intelligence, and just the huge number of sites that China and North Korea have. So is there any way Japan would try to do this without a joint concept of operations with the US? This has got to be a joint and combined, operational concept to work, doesn't it?
Yeah, the establishment of Joint Operation Commander is already in the current NDPG, but for some reason it's not going quite well. But I do believe under the new national security strategy and the national defense program guidelines, I think there will be a establishment of Joint Operation Commander and to deal with very complex operations.
And for people who don't know what a JOC, a Joint Operational Command or Commander would do, that's basically what the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan. The CENTCOM 4-star wasn't in charge of operations. It was usually a 3-star who had the warfighting and operational command and control. And the Australians did this after East Timor, created a Joint Operational Command, somebody who was not the chief of defense, but the one in charge of operations. And for anyone interested, a few years ago, a senior Australian officer came to CSIS and wrote a very detailed paper on how Japan could also learn from Australia's experience, which may have contributed to that NDPG recommendation, which I think is going to be critical. On the Japan-Korea piece, I was impressed that Secretary Blinken had a very good meeting with his Japanese and Korean counterparts in Hawaii because of the North Korean provocations. North Korea can make U.S. Japan-Korea cooperation easier. There is a debate in Seoul with the election about the need to improve relations with Japan. So perhaps there's an opportunity there. I know for the Biden administration, for the U.S. Congress, for pretty much every U.S. expert I know, this is a really high priority. It's filling in that piece of the, what did Hayashi-san called it, force multiplier of these networking of alliances. Really good question here for Bonny on gray zone challenges. With China's new Coast Guard law, are we needing the U.S. and Japan to refresh or update our thinking about how we deal with gray zone challenges from China in the East China Sea or against Taiwan?
I think so. So I think what we need to watch for is how China implements its new gray zone law. And I recommend that perhaps the United States and Japan might think of ways to, bear some of the burden in which how countries might be responding by seeing ways that we could potentially push the limits of this to create more space for other countries to operate in the region. So I think there's much more that the United States and Japan can do. And on this general gray zone challenge, I do expect that China will be generally increasing its gray zone activities as China assesses that its security environment is becoming more and more hostile. And depending on what happens in Ukraine, China could also assess that if its relationship with Russia has become tighter, that perhaps China might be more willing to think about more limited gray zone operations because the United States and other countries might be distracted in Ukraine, but also because as it engages in operations in the region, maybe Russia might be supportive of what China is doing there too. So I think there's a lot to watch, and I would not be surprised if China increases its gray zone operations across the board.
I mean, it sounds like one of the lessons for us from Ukraine is that we need gray zone counter strategies that extend from Japan and Australia to NATO and European friends, dealing with economic embargoes and a whole range of coercion that it's not kinetic, it's not outright military attack. Sasae-san, good. I have a question for you from someone in the audience. They want to know, will Japan join AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US strategic agreement? I don't know, making it what, JAUKUS, I suppose. What do you think?
I never thought about it, but that could be a good food for thought. You know, at this moment, I think Japan's focus is more on Quads, and Quad could be the centerpiece for the regional sort of a safeguard against future Chinese expansion, both not only military, but also political and economic. But when it comes to AUKUS, it's more of US, Australia, UK, kind of Anglo-Saxon typical relationship with intelligence in there. We really, I would say, welcome. If we are welcome, the message clear, I think there should be some debate. But in the meantime, if we are more connected with AUKUS as a sort of a paramilitary alliance of the sort, then there could be some debate.
And the next question, I think I'll direct to Kotani-san. It's from Michaela Easley from National Defense Journal. And the question is about Japan's defense production and defense procurement. As Prime Minister Abe increased the defense budget, the largest supplier of fighters and other equipment, subsystems, and so forth was the U.S. And I may have the number wrong, but foreign military sales, American government supported sales of equipment to Japan reached something over 70% of procurement. So, as you know, within the defense ministry and industry, there was a little bit of panic that Japan was losing its own, indigenous domestic defense industrial base. And my sense, this is not Michaela's question, but my sense is with the F-2 replacement and other systems, there's a little bit of a return or a pushback against imports and joint development, and more of an emphasis on, koksanka, indigenous development and production of jet fighters and other systems. But of course, that's more expensive and takes more time, even though it does support the defense industrial base. Can you give us a sense, Michaela wants to know, will this be in the NDPG or the strategic national security strategy document? What's the nature of the debate right now?
Well, I think it's one of the key items in the upcoming documents. And there's of course, great concern about the future of our defense industries. So, for example, for the Fighter X, there has been a argument that it should be mainly indigenous production. But in reality, particularly the fighters, it's very difficult for Japan to develop its own indigenous capability. So it is now becoming more and more co-production. And I think that would be the realistic direction. So I'm not sure, but my personal guess is that we will seek more joint development and joint production of high-end technologies.
In an ideal world, this would be extended beyond U.S. Japan. You know, Australia is making major investments in production of the kinds of missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, ship-to-ship missiles that Japan needs, and the U.S. production is facing a bottleneck. So, just as the major maritime democracies are aligning behind things like AUKUS and the Quad and U.S. Japan, Australia, there should be, one would think, more cooperation in developing and supporting and sustaining the equipment we need for deterrence. Bonnie, this one's for you. I think it's from Christopher Woody from Business Insider, who asks about the increasing op-tempo, the increasing number of Russian and Chinese operations all up and down the Japanese archipelago. You know, this is not new. The past few years, Russia's air force operations against Japan in the northern territories have reached Cold War levels. So Japan's air self-defense forces are being stretched thin, so is the U.S. Air Force in the theater. How should the U.S.-Japan alliance think about this increasing pressure all up and down the Japanese archipelago, apparently coordinated, if not well aligned, between Russian and Chinese operations to sort of backfoot us and stretch us thin?
I think that's a really great question, and I welcome our Japanese colleagues to also weigh in. My sense is we shouldn't look at these military operations as just coordination on the military end, right? And at least my conversations with Japanese counterparts, it seems to be a concern that these are signaling a larger convergence between Russia and China on dealing with Japan. So there's been some changes in terms of Russian positioning to align more with China on Japan. So what I would be watching for is as China and Russia engage in these exercises, is there any indication that these exercises are anything more than exercises, right? Is there any indication that these exercises could be, in the case of the East China Sea conflict, Russia demonstrating support to potentially come on the side of China? Right now, I don't see that yet because China is engaging in exercises with Russia everywhere, whether that's in East China Sea, whether that's on land in Central Asia, whether that's also in the Indian Ocean. Right now, it seems like the two are strengthening their military cooperation coordination, but I don't see clear signs that Russia is willing to intervene. And what we would be looking for, though, is not so much, for example, in East China Sea conflict, that Russia would, for example, do what it's currently doing in terms of joint patrols, but maybe Russia does something closer to its own borders in the name of its own self-defense, but it creates more uncertainty in terms of how the United States and how Japan thinks about what Russia might do, and we can't be able to flow assets in and from the northern direction. But right now, I think we do need to pay attention to these exercises, but I'm not so alarmed yet of where that is going.
Tetsuo, how does that look to you?
Well, so we have seen more and more China-Russia joint training and exercises around Japan. We just saw the two navies circumnavigated the Japanese archipelago. So when I participated in Taiwan contingency TTX, what I worried was when Japan is supporting the U.S. operations along the southwestern island chain, Russian aircraft intruded into Japanese airspace upper north. And the difficult choice was to ignore the Russian operations upper north, and we focused on the southwestern island operation. So that could be a very difficult situation, either in East China Sea contingency or Taiwan contingency. So we have to consider how we can allocate our very limited resources in such a scenario.
Ken, I'm going to give you the last final word, but before I do, let me just thank you all and thank the audience. We hold these seminars every year privately, not open, so that government officials can participate more freely and brainstorm and test ideas. But we consider this public seminar at least as important because these are hard problems. What you're hearing is a description of a U.S. Japan alliance that has to be not only all of government, but all of society. And it really matters that, students from Georgetown listening, business leaders listening, political leaders, congressional staff, all have to be part of this discussion. We can disagree on some of the tactics or assumptions, but they're big problems and it's going to take all of society. So thank you all very much. And Ken, over to you for our final closing.
Well, thank you very much. Always, this debates on how we could advance our security partnerships is critical to the survival of both nations in the coming difficulties. I think for the next decade or even 2 decades, we have to continue to face this challenge. As somebody was saying that this Chinese communist regime would continue to survive. And of course, they could have some problem, but we have to work based on the assumption that the system could go along as Cuba did over 50 years or so. So we have to be ready. Now, readiness means that we have to increase our own joint deterrence. I would say joint deterrence. So there was some debate about how we could do this. And it does include, of course, the structural reforms and so forth. But on top of that, I think more importantly, our environment is going to be very bad in the coming decades. And as you said it, not only Chinese, but Russia is putting pressure upon us once again. How could we divide our resources north to the south? And then could we work on the strategy like a Kissinger approach, whether to Russia or China? And that kind of debate could be coming on. But both countries are authoritarian and not easy to trust. So that's the question we have to continue to address. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks very much for joining us. Have a good evening and a good day. Thanks.